Sacred Heart Hospital hums at 4 in the morning like a machine that never sleeps, fluorescent lights casting everything the color of old bone. Rachel Torres moves through the cardiac unit with the kind of practiced invisibility that only comes from years of making yourself smaller than the space around you. Her scrubs hang 2 sizes too large, deliberately chosen, the fabric loose enough to hide the lattice of scars crossing both forearms, thin white lines that tell stories she'll never speak aloud. She checks the monitor on bed 7, her hand steady as surgical steel, noting the rhythm without writing anything down. The patient sleeps. She moves to bed 9. Then bed 11. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in glass, a sound most people stop hearing after the first week. Rachel never stops hearing it. In her locker, tucked into the lining of a jacket she hasn't worn in 3 years, sits a faded unit patch from Sangin. 2 inches of threadbare fabric, colors bleeding into each other like a watercolor left in the rain. She touches it once each shift, not superstition, not prayer, just acknowledgement. The way a soldier checks their rifle. Present. Accounted for. Still yours. Dr. Sterling arrives for morning rounds at 6:15, carrying himself like a man who has never questioned whether the room belonged to him. His shoes click on the tile with the precision of a metronome, expensive Italian leather that costs more than Rachel makes in 3 weeks. He scans patient charts with eyes that catalog diagnoses the way a diamond merchant catalogs carats, always calculating value, always computing what each case might yield. The hospital is a machine to him, and every patient is a gear with a price tag attached. He watches Rachel work for exactly 90 seconds. He notices her competence, hands that move without hesitation, vitals recorded with meticulous accuracy, a patient in bed 14 who wakes confused and suddenly calms at the sound of her voice. He notes these things the way a predator notes the quality of its prey. Then he dismisses her entirely. She is temporary staff, a contract nurse, the kind of person who exists to fill gaps and absorb the overflow. Forgettable. Replaceable. Nothing more. But that wasn't the worst part. At 7:40, Rachel passes Dr. Sterling's office during her break. The door stands half open, 10 degrees of negligence that will matter more than either of them knows in that moment. Through the gap, she sees him bent over his desk, pen moving across insurance forms with the casual confidence of a man who has never been questioned. She sees the reclassification codes. Procedure codes that don't match the services rendered. A cardiac catheterization marked as an advanced diagnostic intervention, a single code change that inflates the billing from $4,000 to $12,000. She sees 3 more patients on his screen, each one a similar transformation. The numbers shift like a magician's hands, quick and practiced and absolutely deliberate. Their eyes meet for half a second. Just time enough for recognition. Just time enough for him to smile, the smile a shark gives before it turns, all teeth and no warmth, and for her to understand that he saw her seeing him. Rachel looks away and keeps walking. But her jaw tightens imperceptibly, a muscle flexing beneath the skin like a reflex. She doesn't break stride. She doesn't slow down. She walks to the break room, pours herself black coffee that tastes like machine oil, and sits in the corner where no one sits anymore because everyone knows that corner belongs to the temp nurse. The coffee cools untouched in her hands while the break room around her gradually fills with residents and nurses who don't make eye contact, the way people move around furniture they're planning to throw away. At 8:30, a new admission arrives in a wheelchair pushed by a family member, a blind Army Ranger named James Pritchard, 72 years old, admitted for a routine cardiac catheterization. He moves with the careful precision of someone who has learned to navigate a world he can't see, his hand on the chair's armrest, his blind eyes facing forward with the kind of dignity that comes from refusing to apologize for existing. His daughter walks beside him, a Navy lieutenant in dress blues, her bearing identical to his, the same spine, the same jaw, the same absolute certainty in every movement. Miguel Santos is already in the prep room when they bring him in. Miguel has been working as a surgical tech at Sacred Heart for 6 years, quiet man, reliable, the kind of staff member who shows up on time and doesn't cause problems. He's prepping the catheterization tray with practiced efficiency when Rachel enters to verify the patient's chart and begin the pre-procedure assessment. Miguel is checking supplies, sterile drapes, the diagnostic catheters, the introducer sheath, the flush solution. He glances up as Rachel works, watching her hands as she pulls on gloves, noting the way she positions them, the angle of her wrists, the rhythm of her movements. His hands freeze. The tray of equipment rattles slightly as his fingers go still. Miguel stares at Rachel's hands like he's seeing a ghost made flesh, like someone has just materialized in the prep room from a memory he thought he'd buried. She performs a pre-procedure suture technique to test the materials, routine check, nothing unusual, and Miguel watches her hands move through the motions with the kind of concentrated focus usually reserved for religious experiences. His face goes white. Then gray. Then something else entirely, something that looks like recognition walking through a door that was supposed to stay locked. You? Miguel starts, his voice catching. That technique. The way where did you learn that? Rachel doesn't pause. She continues her assessment with the kind of professional detachment that could double as invisibility. Standard protocol. All our techs know it. No. Miguel's voice drops lower, shaking slightly. That's not standard. That's the Helmand Province technique. Forward surgical team only. Field taught in 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. I remember because I learned it the same way, and I've never seen anyone else. He trails off, watching her hands move with absolute certainty through the suture line. His eyes search her face like he's trying to read an answer written in a language he almost remembers. How long? He whispers. Rachel sets down the equipment and begins charting without meeting his gaze. I need to check the patient's baseline readings. Can you verify the catheters are all accounted for? Miguel doesn't move. The silence stretches between them like something alive. Then, slowly, he nods, not because he understands, but because he recognizes the dismissal. The same dismissal he's heard 1,000 times from people who don't want their past excavated in a supply room at 8 in the morning. He turns back to the tray, his hands moving mechanically through the equipment check, his mind clearly somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with dust storms and outgoing fire and hands performing surgical miracles under conditions that would make most people's hands fail entirely. Rachel finishes her charting. The patient is stable, vitals normal, consent form signed. Everything is ready. She moves toward the door, and as she passes Miguel, she lets her hand brush against his shoulder, not an embrace, not quite, just the smallest acknowledgement that he isn't crazy, that the memory is real, that some things survive the distance between then and now. But that acknowledgement is dangerous. And neither of them fully understands how dangerous yet. The morning continues in fragments. Pritchard's procedure goes smoothly. The cardiac catheterization reveals a minor stenosis, nothing urgent, nothing requiring intervention, just the normal wear and tear of a 72-year-old heart that has been carrying an old soldier through 3 decades of civilian life. Dr. Sterling reviews the results with the kind of disappointment a fisherman might show when his line comes up empty. No complications, no interventions, no advanced procedures to bill. Just a routine case that will yield routine reimbursement. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Rachel is supposed to be gone. Her shift ended at 2, and she's already clocked out. But she returns to the cardiac unit for a reason she tells no one, to verify that a medication order she questioned earlier was actually processed correctly. The medication error rate in Dr. Sterling's unit is higher than protocol allows, and Rachel tracks these things the way a hunter tracks small disturbances in the grass. Awareness. Evidence. She doesn't report them. She just keeps a private accounting, numbers held only in her memory. The cardiac unit is nearly empty at 3:15. Most of the staff is in the cafeteria. The patients are resting. The hallways echo with the particular silence of afternoon shift transitions, that brief window when one team is leaving and another hasn't quite arrived. Perfect silence. Perfect solitude. Rachel passes Dr. Sterling's office again. This time, the door is closed but not locked, hospital policy, even physicians must maintain open-door accessibility during business hours. She doesn't push it open. She doesn't enter. She simply continues walking, her pace unchanged, her breathing steady, her face blank as surgical tape. But as she passes, she sees him through the office window, sitting at his desk, speaking on his personal phone, his voice too low to hear but his body language unmistakable. Animated. Satisfied. The tone of a man who has just completed a transaction and is now discussing terms. The billing codes. The inflated procedures. The $4,000 transformed into $12,000, multiplied across how many patients? She doesn't know yet. But she will. That's not a threat or a promise, it's just a simple statement of fact. Rachel Torres has spent 15 years in environments where leaving threats unmade and promises unspoken was the difference between a completed mission and a body bag. Silence is her language. Observation is her weapon. And Dr. Sterling has just made the mistake of believing that because she's quiet, she's powerless. At 3:42, a paramedic radio crackles in the distance, the kind of urgent tone that means an incoming trauma case. The ambulance sirens wail through the Portland afternoon like something wounded, and Rachel's hands tremble. Just barely. Just enough that she has to press them flat against her thighs as she stands in the empty break room, waiting for the involuntary response to pass. The tremor lasts approximately 4 seconds. Her hands return to normal. No one sees. No one will ever know that when ambulance sirens wail, they carry her back to a place where the sirens meant something different, where they meant incoming wounded, where they meant her hands had exactly 90 seconds to make the difference between alive and dead. She pours the cold coffee down the sink and washes her cup with deliberate care, using the water temperature and the sensation of ceramic under her fingers to ground herself in the present tense. Present location. Present date. Present timeline. The weight of her own awareness settles back down like fog, heavy, familiar, the price of being the person who sees everything while remaining invisible to everyone. By the time she leaves the hospital at 4 o'clock, she has already decided that she will photograph the billing codes on Dr. Sterling's computer. She will send those photographs to federal authorities. She will do this quietly, without drama, without announcing her intentions, the way a hunter moves through woods. Because some truths are too large to ignore, and some debts to the system cannot be paid any other way than through the quiet accumulation of evidence that even a surgeon cannot charm away. The afternoon sun hits her windshield as she drives toward her apartment, casting everything in shades of gold and amber. She touches the unit patch through her jacket lining one more time, a ritual that means something different now. No longer asking for permission to survive. Now asking for clarity. For precision. For the steady hands that will do what needs to be done, documented and deliberate. Dr. Sterling has no idea that his moment of carelessness, that open office door, that visible computer screen, that assumption that a temp nurse is too insignificant to pose any threat, has just set in motion a series of events that will end his career. He doesn't know that the invisible woman who moves through his unit is tracking him with the focus of apex predators tracking wounded prey. He doesn't know that in approximately 6 months, he'll be teaching CPR to bored community college students at minimum wage, wondering how everything collapsed so completely and so quietly. But Rachel Torres knows. And sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one you've already forgotten is standing there. The red marker came out during morning rounds. Dr. Sterling stood at the central nursing station, the cardiac unit bustling around him with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday shift, monitor beeps overlapping, shoes clicking on polished tile, the distant hiss of oxygen flowing through wall ports. He uncapped the marker with theatrical deliberation and wrote across the assignment board in letters thick enough to read from the hallway, R. Torres, improper documentation, final warning. The cap snapped back on like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. Nurses pretended not to notice. They always did. But they noticed. Rachel saw it when she arrived for her 7 a.m. shift, her scrubs still damp from the Portland rain outside. She stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds, reading her name in red ink like a diagnosis she'd already suspected. Her jaw tightened, not visibly, just a shift in the muscles beneath her skin that only someone trained to read bodies would catch. She didn't look around to see who was watching. She already knew. Dr. Sterling stood near the supply closet, coffee in hand, waiting for her reaction. Waiting for her to crumble. waiting for the moment when she'd excuse herself to cry in a bathroom stall like the other nurses did when he'd humiliated them. Rachel reached for a chart instead. Her movements were precise, economical, the movements of someone whose hands had learned efficiency in places where hesitation cost lives. She didn't acknowledge the board. Didn't acknowledge Sterling. Didn't acknowledge the 5 pairs of eyes tracking her across the unit. "Breakfast?" asked Maya Chen, one of the newer RNs, her voice tentative. She was young enough that she still thought civility mattered when a doctor had decided to destroy someone. "I'm fine," Rachel said. Her voice came out the way it always did, steady, courteous, the voice of someone apologizing for existing. "Thank you." By noon, Sterling had moved to his next play. He cornered her outside room 412 where James Pritchard lay in pre-op, the blind army ranger from Sangin who'd checked in 2 days ago for a routine cardiac catheterization. Pritchard's daughter sat beside his bed, hand wrapped around his, her face the particular shade of exhausted worry that families wore when their loved ones entered hospitals. Emily Pritchard had kind eyes. She looked like the type who believed in second chances. "Miss Torres," Sterling said, his voice carrying the warmth of a man about to perform something he'd rehearsed. "Since you're here, perhaps you could demonstrate your sterile field technique for the family. It's always good for patients to understand the level of care they'll receive." Rachel's hand stilled over her supplies. The sterile drape lay half unfurled on the instrument tray, cotton white and waiting. "Actually," Sterling continued, already stepping closer, already raising his voice so it would carry down the corridor where 2 more nurses had stopped to listen, "we should be more careful. Everyone, observe this." He gestured at her hands with the contempt usually reserved for contaminated specimens. "This is precisely how not to establish a sterile field. Notice the breach here? Notice the angle? Miss Torres seems to believe that temporary staff operate under different infection control standards than the physicians who actually bear responsibility for patient outcomes." Emily Pritchard's eyes widened. James Pritchard's blind face turned toward Sterling's voice, confusion settling into his features like sediment. "Mr. Pritchard," Sterling said, his tone dripping with theatrical concern, "you're a decorated veteran. You deserve better than—" He paused, gesturing at Rachel as if she were a contaminated instrument. "This." The silence lasted 2 seconds. Then Rachel took one measured breath. She didn't defend herself. Didn't explain. Didn't rush. She simply wiped her hands on her scrubs, looked directly at Sterling, and felt a single tear escape down her right cheek. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, and said quietly, "I've seen better men than you crack under less pressure, Doctor." Sterling's smile froze. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Fear, maybe. Recognition, possibly. The understanding that he'd misjudged the depth of something standing in front of him. "That's insubordination," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "We'll discuss your future here very soon." He left. Rachel continued her prep with hands that didn't shake, movements that didn't falter, composure that held like a fortress built over 15 years and 3 deployments. The break room exile began that afternoon. Rachel sat at the corner table with her lunch, a container of rice and grilled chicken that tasted like cardboard and determination, and within 30 seconds, 5 nurses suddenly remembered urgent tasks elsewhere. Chairs scraped. Voices lowered. Maya Chen gathered her untouched yogurt and offered a sympathetic glance that made everything worse. By the next day, they didn't even make excuses. Rachel would sit, and the room would empty like she'd brought a contagion through the doors. On the 3rd day, she stopped going to the break room altogether. 2 days later, during medication administration on the cardiac unit, Rachel caught a dosage error that would have stopped a patient's heart. The order read 10 milligrams of metoprolol instead of 1 milligram, a 10-fold overdose of a beta blocker that could have collapsed the patient's cardiac output and made him unrevivable. She'd caught it because she'd learned to read charts the way soldiers read terrain, pattern recognition, anomaly detection, the ability to spot the single thing that didn't fit before it killed someone. She approached Sterling privately in the hallway outside room 408, her voice quiet so only he would hear. "Doctor, I think there's a dosage discrepancy on." He erupted. "You dare question a physician's judgment?" His voice wasn't loud, it was worse than loud. It was the controlled fury of a man accustomed to obedience. Heads turned down the corridor. A resident froze mid-step. "You're a temp nurse with delusions of competence. I didn't ask for your input. I didn't ask for your amateur diagnosis. And I certainly didn't ask you to contradict my orders in public." Rachel stood perfectly still. Her composure was absolute, jaw set, shoulders level, hands at her sides. She absorbed every word without flinching, without defending, without anything except the fortress of her face. "I'll correct the order," Sterling continued, stepping closer until she could smell his cologne, something expensive and aggressive that probably cost more than she made in a week. "And then you're going to apologize for your insubordination, or I'm going to ensure that no hospital in this state hires you again. Do you understand me?" "Yes, doctor," Rachel said. Quiet. Compliant. The perfect picture of a chastened temp nurse. He'd corrected the order, actually corrected it, because he was competent enough to realize the error was real, and walked away satisfied with his victory, never understanding that Rachel had already documented the interaction, that she'd already photographed the original order with her phone 3 minutes before confronting him, that she'd already sent both images to an FBI field office in Seattle with a message that began, "Medicare fraud, systematic patient billing overages, cardiac unit." That night, after her shift ended at 11 p.m., Rachel drove through Portland rain that hammered the windshield like applause. The wipers squeaked in their rhythm, 1, 2, 1, 2, as she navigated toward Mount Calvary Cemetery, where the stones rose from the wet grass like a city of the dead. She knelt in the mud at marker 847B, and the rain soaked through her scrubs, through her jacket, through the layers of everything she'd built to survive, leaving her past behind. Inside the jacket lining, the faded unit patch of the 75th Ranger Regiment grew heavy with water. She'd sewn it there 6 years ago, when she'd still thought she could run far enough that nobody would find her. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. The voice that came out of her throat wasn't the voice she used at Sacred Heart. It was rougher, lower, the voice of someone who'd given orders that got people killed and had to live with the knowing. "I can't keep running. I failed you." Thomas Michael Torres, Navy SEAL, KIA 2014, didn't answer. He never did anymore. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Miguel Santos, the combat medic from the 75th Ranger Regiment, had recognized her hands during James Pritchard's pre-op, and sometime during this night while she was kneeling in the rain at her dead husband's grave, he was going to start asking questions. And questions like that didn't stay quiet in military communities. Questions like that traveled through unit WhatsApp groups and veteran networks and Facebook pages for people who'd served together in Helmand Province. Questions like that had a way of turning into answers that changed everything. Dr. Sterling's office smelled like leather and expensive cologne, the kind that cost more than Rachel made in a week. He sat behind his mahogany desk at 11:48 p.m., the hospital corridor empty below him, and dialed Martin Chen's personal number. The phone rang twice. Answered on the third. "Martin. It's Sterling. I need a favor." His voice was smooth as oil on water. Nothing dramatic. Just a quiet credentialing review of a temp nurse in cardiac. Name's Torres. She's been making documentation errors, nothing catastrophic, but it's a pattern. I want it on record before it becomes a liability. The pause on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "You want me to escalate her file? I want you to open an investigation. Formal. Nothing that shows up in the break room gossip. Just between the credentialing committee." Sterling leaned back in his chair, the leather sighing like it understood what was happening. "I've got an outside consultant I trust. Let me handle the details." Chen's voice came back quieter. "How serious is this?" "Serious enough that I'm calling at midnight instead of waiting for morning rounds." Sterling smiled. He didn't need Chen to see it to know the message landed. They'd played 18 holes together for 6 years. Chen understood how this worked. By 2:33 a.m., Sterling had sent Chen a formal request for credentialing review, citing 3 incidents, all documented, all twisted just enough that context evaporated. The medication error Rachel had caught and corrected became questioned physician's judgment. The documentation she'd meticulously completed became inconsistent notation patterns. The patient prep she'd executed flawlessly became procedural gaps during observation. The trap was already springing. Rachel didn't know it yet. Sterling's next call went to Dr. Mitchell Hartley, a risk management consultant based in Seattle who specialized in exactly these situations, the quiet dismantling of people who didn't fit the institutional narrative. Hartley owed Sterling favors. One phone call was enough to activate that debt. "I need a credential review conducted by end of week," Sterling said without preamble. Temp nursing staff member at Sacred Heart, Portland. Torres, first name Rachel. "The hospital will formally request it through their credentialing committee, but I need you to understand the actual scope before you receive the official paperwork." Hartley listened. Sterling spoke. The framework was established, not as a medical inquiry but as a predetermined conclusion awaiting documentation. "What am I looking for?" Hartley asked. "Patterns of independent decision-making without proper authorization. Documented complaints from supervising physicians. Questions about her clinical judgment under pressure." Sterling's voice had the texture of someone describing a storm he'd already survived. "She's a temp. No institutional protection. No permanent staff to advocate for her. This should move quickly." By dawn, Sterling had already begun the 3rd phase. Rachel's listed references were 4 names she'd provided during intake: a nursing supervisor from a clinic in Eugene, a charge nurse from a temporary staffing agency, a hospital administrator from a facility in Salem, and Dr. Kenneth Walsh, a cardiologist she'd worked with in Seattle 5 years prior. All previous employers. All people who knew her clinical work but not her actual life. Sterling called them in sequence, his voice perfectly measured, perfectly concerned. To the Eugene supervisor, "I'm Dr. Sterling, cardiac department at Sacred Heart. We've got a temp named Torres working with us, and I'm seeing some concerning patterns with independent decision-making. Have you noticed anything like that in her previous work? Instances where she might have acted outside her scope." To the staffing agency, "Hi, this is Dr. Sterling from Sacred Heart. One of your temps, Rachel Torres, is working our cardiac unit. I'm just doing some routine reference checks and want to understand if there were any issues during her previous placements. Any complaints? Any concerns about following protocol?" To the Salem administrator, "I'm calling about Rachel Torres. She's currently working a temporary assignment with us, and we've had some documentation issues come up. Did you ever have any similar concerns about her attention to detail or her ability to follow hospital policy?" To Dr. Walsh in Seattle, "Ken, it's Sterling from Sacred Heart in Portland. You worked with Rachel Torres several years ago. I've got her as a reference on her current application. Have you heard from her recently? And just between us, did you ever have concerns about her clinical judgment?" Independent streak. The calls were masterpieces of insinuation. Sterling never accused. Never stated. He simply asked questions shaped like accusations, each one designed to dislodge doubt. Even people trying to be fair would hesitate. They'd remember a missed call, a scheduling conflict, an afternoon when Torres stayed late without being asked. Uncertainty would bloom. The references would hedge their answers. And hedged answers, when documented by Hartley's consultant firm, would read like admission of doubt. By Thursday morning, the official credentialing interview was scheduled. Rachel received the notification in an email marked Human Resources with a meeting time of 1:56 p.m. in Conference Room B. No explanation. No context. Just administrative machinery beginning to spin. The email read, "Rachel Torres is requested to attend a formal credentialing review meeting with external consultant Dr. Mitchell Hartley on November 14 at 1:02 p.m., Conference Room B, Building 2. This is a routine procedural review. Please bring your original licensure documents and clinical certifications." She read it twice while standing at the medication station. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. But something inside her shifted, the recognition that the game had moved from invisible to institutional. Sterling wasn't just humiliating her anymore. He was building a structure that would bury her. Miguel Santos found her 20 minutes later in the break room, standing motionless with her coffee gone cold in her hands. He didn't speak at first, just stood beside her until the silence became its own kind of conversation. "I heard about the review," Miguel said quietly. "Word travels in the vet community. People asking about you on the network. Asking what I saw with that suture technique." Rachel set her coffee down without drinking it. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing." "But Rachel," Miguel turned to face her fully. "I know what I saw in your hands. And I know what that costs. Whatever's happening here, whoever's pushing back, they don't understand who they are fighting." The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above them, the constant white noise of hospitals that Rachel had learned to hear as a kind of breathing. In 3 hours she would sit across from Dr. Hartley and answer questions designed to destroy her. In 5 hours, her clearance would probably be suspended pending investigation. In a week, the credentialing file would be thick enough to justify termination. But James Pritchard's catheterization was scheduled for the next afternoon, and Rachel had made a decision while standing in that break room. Whatever happened at that meeting, whatever institutional machinery Sterling had set in motion, that blind ranger was not going to die from neglect on her watch. She finished her shift at 11:56 p.m. and drove home through the Portland rain, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement like scattered coins. Her apartment was dark when she arrived. She changed into civilian clothes and sat on her bed with the faded unit patch in her hands, the one James Pritchard had pressed into her palm 15 years ago in Sangin, the one she'd kept sewn inside her jacket lining ever since. Tomorrow she would walk into that credentialing meeting and let Sterling's institutional machinery document her as a liability. But tonight, she held the patch and understood something Sterling had fundamentally miscalculated. She had already lived through worse than losing a job. She had already survived combat. She had already learned how to function when everything around her was breaking. A hospital administrator and a corrupted consultant were children playing with matches compared to the fire she'd already walked through. The rain hammered against her windows like applause for a decision already made. 48 hours after the catheterization, Rachel checks James Pritchard's vitals during her shift and notices his neck veins distended like cords pulled tight beneath his skin. She observes his respiratory rate climbing, 22 breaths per minute, then 24. His oxygen saturation drifts down to 91%. The monitors show his pressure dropping incrementally, a slow bleed downward that nobody else seems to be watching. Rachel has seen this pattern before in a field hospital in Sangin when a patient's pericardial sac filled with blood and squeezed his heart like a fist closing. She knows exactly what it means. She finds Dr. Sterling in the break room reviewing his phone, and her voice carries the careful deference of someone who has learned to make herself smaller in rooms with power. "Doctor, I'm seeing signs of pericardial effusion on your catheterization patient. Elevated JVD, tachypnea, dropping oxygen saturation. I think we should get a stat echocardiogram." Dr. Sterling doesn't look up. His coffee cup sits half empty on the table, steam still rising from the black surface. "Stop practicing medicine without a license, Torres. I know what I did in that procedure. There's no effusion." The words land with the deliberate weight of someone who has practiced dismissing her. He finally glances up, his eyes carrying that particular brand of contempt reserved for people he believes have overstepped their station. "Your job is vitals and documentation, not diagnosis. Stick to your lane." Rachel stands there for exactly 3 seconds. She could push. She knows the clinical signs well enough to fight this, the distended neck veins, the muffled heart sound she detected when she listened, the pressure trending downward like a slow-motion collapse. But she also knows that Dr. Sterling has allies, that hospital politics move slower than cardiac decompensation, that fighting him will only accelerate her termination. So she nods once, turns, and walks back to the cardiac unit where James Pritchard's condition continues its quiet deterioration. By mid-afternoon, everything accelerates. Rachel enters his room for another vitals check and immediately sees the change written across his face. His breathing has become labored, each inhalation a visible effort. His skin carries the grey pallor of someone whose blood pressure is dropping faster than his body can compensate. The blind ranger's head tilts toward her voice. I don't feel right. His oxygen saturation reads 88%. His blood pressure is 92/56 and trending downward. Rachel's hands move automatically, checking his pulse, 134 and weak, already. She recognizes the cascade now, pericardial effusion that's become cardiac tamponade, the blood in the sac pressing against the heart until it can't fill properly, blood pressure collapsing, oxygen saturation plummeting, every second counting toward irreversible shock. She activates the call light, but the light moves slowly in hospital time. 30 seconds. 60. A nursing assistant appears. Rachel's voice remains level but carries an edge that cuts through casual assumptions. Get Dr. Sterling to this room immediately. Tell him it's emergent. The assistant nods and leaves. Rachel places a hand on Pritchard's shoulder. You're going to be fine. I'm here. She said those words before in places where mortars fell and the only surgeon available was her. Dr. Sterling arrives 3 minutes later with the casual confidence of someone unaccustomed to being wrong. His eyes scan the monitor, and Rachel watches his expression shift from annoyance to something else, something that looks like fear, but not for the patient. His calculating liability, malpractice implications, the ways this admission of error could unravel his careful construction of institutional power. He orders an EKG. He orders an echocardiogram. He does not order an intervention. James Pritchard's oxygen saturation drops to 83%. His blood pressure is 88/48. His breathing becomes gasping, desperate, the sound of a man whose heart is being strangled from within. The monitor shows sinus tachycardia racing at 142 beats per minute, the desperate rhythm of a system in collapse. The echo takes 8 minutes to complete. 8 minutes during which Rachel watches Dr. Sterling stand in the doorway, phone in hand, making calls about liability and investigations and whose career will survive this moment. The echo confirms what Rachel already knew, pericardial effusion with acute tamponade. The attending radiologist's voice comes through the speaker, significant fluid. Hemodynamically significant. Intervention needed now. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightens. He looks at the patient. He looks at Rachel. And he hesitates. The silence stretches like taffy pulled. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The liability calculus is visible in his expression, admitting error, allowing an uncontrolled outcome, facing the paperwork trail that will lead directly to his Medicare fraud. The window for survival is closing. Rachel can feel it like pressure in her chest. She moves. There's no request, no permission, no professional courtesy. She's moving before her conscious mind finishes the decision. Miguel Santos appears in the doorway. He's been watching, waiting, recognizing that something is about to break open. Get me a 14-gauge for catheter, ultrasound machine, and move him to the hallway. Now. It's not a question. It's a command in a voice that carries the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Miguel doesn't hesitate. He and another nurse wheel the bed into the hallway outside the ICU where the light is better and the space is clearer. Rachel's hands move with muscle memory that predates her current life by 18 years. She positions Pritchard supine. She visualizes the anatomy, the xiphoid process, the angle of the ribs, the trajectory to the pericardial sac beneath. The ultrasound probe shows the effusion clearly, dark blood pooling around the heart like a siege. Needle coming in, she announces to no one in particular, though Miguel is there holding the patient steady, and his hands are trembling because he knows what he's looking at. Rachel advances the catheter at a 45-degree angle below the xiphoid process, through the skin, through the subcutaneous tissue, the needle advancing with the controlled pressure that feels like breathing, that feels like the 1,000 times she did this in a place where waiting meant death. The ultrasound shows the needle tip approaching the effusion. 1 more millimeter. She advances and dark blood fills the syringe like a confession. The tamponade releases. It happens in real time. Pritchard's oxygen saturation climbs to 94% within 30 seconds. His blood pressure rises to 108/70. His breathing shifts from gasping to labor to something approaching normal. The heart monitor shows sinus tachycardia that's beginning to moderate. Life returning, one number at a time. Rachel withdraws the needle with the same steady hands that are now going to cost her everything. Emily Pritchard arrives in the hallway minutes later, still in her navy dress uniform from her base, pulled from leave by a nurse's urgent call. She sees her father breathing normally, oxygen saturation climbing, and something in her face transforms. She steps toward Rachel, and for a moment there's a crack in her military bearing. "Thank you. Thank you." But Dr. Sterling is already on his phone in the corner, his voice low and urgent, the tone of someone calling in favors from people who owe him things. "Martin, we have a massive liability issue. Unsupervised invasive procedure, no attending supervision, no informed consent documentation. I need her credentials pulled immediately and an investigation opened before anyone asks questions about who authorized this." The call lasts 90 seconds. By the time Rachel has documented the procedure, the time, the indication, the fluid withdrawal, the response, Patricia Voss and 2 hospital administrators are walking toward her. Their faces carry the rehearsed sympathy of people delivering predetermined decisions. "Rachel, we need to escort you to a conference room." It's not an offer. It's a procedure, executed with the same clinical precision she just used to save a man's life. The conference room is beige and fluorescent lit, and they sit across from her at a table that smells like old coffee and institutional failure. Patricia Voss slides a document across the table. "Pending the investigation into this incident, your nursing license is suspended effective immediately. You'll need to surrender your credentials and your hospital badge." Rachel signs without reading it. She's signed enough documents to recognize the shape of her own ending. Her hand is steady. Her face is a mask of quiet dignity that gives away nothing. She stands, leaves the badge on the table, and walks out without looking back. That night her apartment is silent in a way that feels like absence. The faded unit patch that she's kept sewn inside her jacket lining sits on the kitchen table in front of her, a relic she pulled free and cannot put away. Olive drab and worn, the colors faded to ghosts of themselves, the stitching fraying at the edges. She stares at it without tears, too empty for tears, too familiar with loss to be surprised by its arrival. She's lost this before, or the military, the identity, the purpose, the man she married who understood the weight of hands that had held lives together. Now she's lost the last place she thought she could hide and be useful. The apartment is too quiet. Outside, Portland rain hammers against the windows like applause, like judgment, like the sound of a door closing quietly behind someone walking away from everything. But that wasn't the moment everything changed. The moment was the next morning when Dr. Sterling conducted his rounds with Patricia Voss and the administrator in tow, performing his rehearsed statement about protocol violations and institutional standards. Nobody told Rachel she couldn't visit. The suspension meant she couldn't work, but nobody said she couldn't check on a patient she'd saved. She enters James Pritchard's room from the side while Sterling is mid-sentence, launching into his narrative about unfortunate lapses and necessary investigations. Pritchard's face turns toward her voice instantly, his blind eyes finding her anyway, the way blind men find things that matter. His hand shoots out with startling accuracy, gripping her wrist, and his voice comes rough from the intubation tube damage, rough and certain, Valkyrie. The room goes dead silent. It's the kind of silence where you can hear the fluorescent lights hum their mechanical prayer. The needle gleams under the fluorescent strip, and Rachel's fingers move with the kind of precision that doesn't exist in civilian medical training. 18 gauge. The hallway outside the ICU is crowded now, staff frozen in tableau, watching her hands work with a certainty that belongs to operating theaters under fire, not Portland hospital corridors. Miguel Santos holds Pritchard steady, his own breathing controlled, his eyes locked on Rachel's face like he's watching someone resurrect from the dead. "Stop this immediately," Dr. Sterling shouts from somewhere behind her, his voice fracturing at the edges. You have no authority, no supervision, this is criminal negligence. Rachel doesn't respond. Pain is information. The needle finds the pericardial space with the same fluid confidence she used 17 years ago in a forward surgical base outside Sangin, guiding a catheter into a Marine whose chest had filled with blood while mortars walked closer. Her hands remember what her mind tried to forget. The dark blood comes back into the syringe, thick and damning evidence of pressure crushing Pritchard's heart. 1 draw. 2. 3. The relief is immediate and visible. Pritchard's oxygen saturation climbing from 67 to 71 to 78, his chest rising easier, the monitor's frantic rhythm steadying into something closer to sinus. Nobody moves. The fluorescent lights buzz their mechanical prayer, and Rachel withdraws the needle with the same controlled motion, already moving toward the medication cart before anyone registers that the crisis has ended. Pritchard's blind eyes open wider, searching, and he whispers a single word that makes Miguel's hands clench, Valkyrie. Sterling's face drains of color. His mouth opens and closes like something electronic with the batteries dying. He's staring at Rachel's hands, still steady, already gloved with fresh latex, and she can watch the calculation happening behind his eyes. He's smart enough to understand what just happened. He's not smart enough to understand what he's looking at. The next voice they hear isn't a whisper. It's a phone call, and Sterling makes it in the hallway with his back turned, his voice low and urgent. "Martin, it's Marcus. We need to move now." She just performed an unsupervised procedure. No resident present, no attending, no documentation pre-authorization. Pericardiocentesis in a public hallway during shift change. We have witnesses, we have a violation stack, we can have her suspended before end of shift. He listens, then, I don't care if the patient survived. The procedure itself is the violation. Call your risk management contact, activate the federal investigation now. I want her credentials pulled within the hour. Rachel knows exactly what's happening. She's been expecting it. The institutional machinery doesn't care about outcomes, it cares about procedure, about who holds the authority to make decisions, about the careful hierarchies that keep the system functional. Sterling is weaponizing that machinery against her with the precision of someone who's spent a career understanding exactly where to push. He hangs up the phone and turns to face her, and his expression has shifted from panic to something colder and more calculated. "We'll be reviewing this incident with the credentialing board," he says, his voice steady again, professional, the voice of a man who's already won. "Your temporary privileges are under immediate review pending investigation." Rachel nods once. She doesn't argue. She's learned in the past 72 hours that arguing only gives them more ammunition. Instead, she turns to Miguel. "Stay with him. Monitor his vitals every 15 minutes for the next 4 hours. Watch for signs of reaccumulation, any change in oxygen saturation, any increase in JVD, you call me immediately." Miguel salutes her. Not a casual gesture. A formal, precise, military salute delivered in the middle of a hospital hallway at shift change. If Sterling sees it, he doesn't register what it means. Rachel watches him process the moment, watches him understand that something has shifted in the room, that the invisible hierarchy he'd been comfortable dominating has suddenly reorganized itself around someone else entirely. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part is that she's known since the beginning that this was coming. She documented everything. She photographed Sterling's billing codes 3 nights ago, standing in the empty cardiac unit at 2:27 a.m. with her phone camera held steady as a scalpel, capturing the spreadsheets that showed cardiac catheterizations billed as advanced ablation procedures, routine echocardiograms marked as complex diagnostic interventions, $847,000 in fraudulent billing across 134 patient accounts over 18 months. She sent the files to an email address, not hers, never hers, a federal tip line that she knew would route to the FBI's healthcare fraud task force because Miguel mentioned once that his nephew worked there, and Rachel has always been very good at listening to the details other people think don't matter. She submitted those files 3 days before Pritchard crashed. She'd been prepared for Sterling's retaliation before he even knew it was coming. The next afternoon, at 1:15 p.m., Two federal agents walk through the main lobby of Sacred Heart during shift change. They don't announce themselves. They just appear beside Dr. Sterling as he's walking toward the cafeteria, and one of them, a woman with the kind of face that's seen too much, holds up credentials and says, "Dr. Marcus Sterling. I'm Special Agent Rebecca Halsey, FBI. We need to talk about your billing practices." The lobby goes silent the way lobbies go silent when the power structure just shifted underneath everyone's feet. 200 staff members, visitors, patients in wheelchairs, all of them suddenly aware that the hospital is no longer quite the same place it was 30 seconds ago. The agents don't cuff him in front of the crowd, they're professional enough to offer him that dignity, but they do walk him toward the exit with the kind of escort that says this isn't optional. Local news cameras are already set up outside. Someone tipped them off. Rachel doesn't know who, and she doesn't ask. She just watches from the back of the lobby, her face completely neutral, and thinks about how institutions protect themselves by removing the people who threaten them, sometimes slowly and sometimes all at once. Margaret Whitmore, the hospital administrator, steps into Sterling's path before he reaches the exit. She's a woman in her 60s with the kind of authority that comes from understanding exactly how power moves through buildings. She speaks loudly enough for every microphone to catch every word. "Dr. Marcus Sterling, you are terminated from Sacred Heart effective immediately for gross misconduct, fraud, and violations of patient care standards. Security will escort you from the premises. We are also revoking all departmental recommendations, rescinding your privileges at partner institutions, and cooperating fully with federal prosecutors in the investigation into your billing practices." Her voice carries the weight of institutional fury, the sound of an organization protecting its reputation by sacrificing the cancer that was growing inside it. This hospital does not condone fraud. This hospital does not condone the endangerment of patients. And this hospital certainly does not condone the intimidation of staff members attempting to provide competent care. Sterling's face cycles through denial, rage, and finally broken pleading. "Margaret, we've known each other for 15 years, this is a misunderstanding." She turns her back on him mid-sentence. The crowd watches in absolute silence as he's led through the automatic doors to a waiting federal vehicle. The rubber seal hisses as the doors slide open. The sound of them closing again feels like the end of something. Rachel observes from the back of the crowd, her face unreadable. She's wearing her scrubs, and pinned to her chest, not hidden, not tucked inside her jacket anymore, but openly displayed, is the faded unit patch. Army Ranger insignia. Sangin Valley designation. The one James Pritchard pressed into her palm 14 years ago when she was someone else entirely, someone who was trying to help him when helping him meant risking everything. Miguel Santos stands beside her at parade rest, his shoulders back, his chin level, his eyes fixed on the exit where Sterling just disappeared. Emily Pritchard, still in her Navy Reserve uniform from the morning watch, steps forward from the crowd and salutes her. Not casually. Formally. A gesture that means more than gratitude, it means recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement that she's been standing next to someone whose service runs deeper than temporary nursing shifts and quiet documentation. The news footage runs that night on every Portland station. The headline reads, "Decorated Navy veteran exposes hospital fraud while saving patient's life." Rachel's picture appears in the segment, not a photo the station took, but one from her file, one she hasn't seen since she changed her name on intake forms to just Torres and told no one where she'd gone to heal. The commentator discusses her Bronze Star, her Purple Heart, her Navy Commendation Medal, the 17 lives she'd saved under fire during deployments to Helmand Province. They don't ask her for a statement. She's already given everything she's willing to give to the public record. The rest, the 17 years of silence, the PTSD that still arrives as electrical current through her nervous system when a siren wails, the therapy that happens in a cemetery once a month, the husband she couldn't save even though she saved everyone else, those remain hers. 6 months later, Rachel learns through a former colleague that Dr. Sterling, stripped of his medical license pending trial, is teaching CPR classes at a community college on the south side of Portland for minimum wage. His consulting firm never recovered. Martin Chen resigned from the board under investigation for his role in the credentialing abuse. Patricia Voss's risk management contracts dried up when the referral fee scheme emerged in court discovery. The institutional machinery that Sterling tried to activate against Rachel turned around and consumed him instead. Rachel feels nothing, not satisfaction, not vindication, just the quiet recognition that some equations balance themselves if you wait long enough and document carefully enough. She doesn't celebrate. She doesn't process this as victory. Instead, she drives to the veteran cemetery in Tualatin on an afternoon when the rain is soft and the oak trees are starting to shift toward autumn, and she kneels at her husband's grave. Thomas had been a Marine. He'd been killed in 2011 in Helmand Province, and she'd spent the next 14 years running from the man she'd been when it happened. She traces his name on the stone, Thomas James Torres, 1979 to 2011, he protected us, and she finally lets herself speak the thing that's been trapped in her chest since she walked away from everything. I can't run anymore, she whispers. I can't keep pretending I'm someone else. I need to testify. I need to stand up and say what I saw, what I know, what I've done. I need to stop hiding behind a temporary name and a temporary life. I need to stop pretending that hiding keeps anyone safe. The rain doesn't answer. The stone doesn't answer. But something in her chest loosens, like a valve opening, like pressure being released slowly and deliberately. She stays at the cemetery until sunset, and when she drives back toward the city, she's already made the decision. She will testify fully about her observations of Sterling's fraud. She will stand in court and speak her own history out loud. She will stop being the person who documents crimes from the shadows and become the person who speaks the truth in the light. That takes more courage than any emergency procedure she's ever performed. That terrifies her in a way that cardiac tamponade never will. But James Pritchard is alive because she refused to hide. And that's the beginning of understanding that maybe, finally, she can afford to stop running from her own name. Thanks for watching. If you found Rachel's story powerful, please subscribe, like, and comment below. What would you have done if you were standing in that hospital lobby watching the woman who saved a patient's life get publicly destroyed? Let me know.